Hi, everyone, and welcome along to the Ergonomically Speaking podcast, the podcast that aims to help you reduce and even eliminate work related discomfort. I am your host, Neve Pentney of Boyne Ergonomics. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope that you're able to take away some useful practical advice from this podcast to help you reduce your own risk of discomfort at the workplace or help manage the risks among the people that you might be responsible for. So, now that we know why we're here, let's get started. Hello, and welcome along to episode 22 of the Ergonomically Speaking podcast, where today I'm going to be talking to you about neurodiversity in the workplace and what we can do to help foster neurodiversity and to allow employees with a neurodivergence to flourish in the workplace. A lot of my blog posts and my podcast episodes so far have focused on the physical. So, your chairs, your desks, your screens, your keyboards, and how those can contribute towards a healthy workplace and keeping the employees safe and well. And that is, of course, a hugely important part because the equipment will determine the positioning and the posture and the stress and the strain on the body. But what I've learned over the last few years, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree with me, is that there is only so much that equipment can do in a workplace because there's often other factors at play that will influence somebody's health and well-being in the workplace. And one of those factors is neurodiversity or a person's neurological makeup. So we're all made differently, we're all wired differently, as we would say here. But there are certain neurological makeups that don't flourish in the standard office environment or the standard organizational environment because of how they process and retain and manage information. So, what I want to talk about today in this podcast episode, firstly, is well, what is meant by the term neurodiversity as it pertains particularly to employees in the workplace. So, that's going to be the focus. Some of the challenges that a neurodivergent employee can face in the workplace, and then what employers, what organizations can do to address these challenges and reap the benefits of having a neurodiverse workforce, because that is really, really important. So, this is quite a general overview. So, for those of you who don't know, neurodiversity is an area of interest for me. I find it so fascinating. But what I also find is over time, I found that some organizations, some employers would be quite happy after an assessment to pay for a new chair, pay for a new screen, pay for all the equipment. But then when it comes to recommendations and accommodations to be made that address maybe somebody's processing difficulties, they're a little less happy to go with that. And even some recommendations that aren't going to cost the organization any money, they can be quite reluctant to put those in place. And I think a lot of it comes from a lack of understanding that we don't all process information differently. So it's not just that we need different equipment. Some of us need to do our tasks slightly different. Some of us need accommodations to allow us to complete our tasks efficiently and with the minimal amount of stress. So, neurodiversity for me has been an area of interest, and I've wanted to do this podcast episode for ages. But to be honest, every time I was doing research and I was compiling information, I got down such a rabbit hole. And then the rabbit hole led to a wormhole. And I had so much information that I found it really hard to condense it into a useful podcast and a useful blog post. So that's what I've done today. It's going to be quite general. And then what I plan to do in the future, maybe in the new year, with some episodes, is to focus on specific difficulties. So, for example, what we could do for an employee that is dyslexic, or what we could do for the employee that is on the autism spectrum, or what we could do for the employee that might have ADHD. But for now, this is quite general. But there will still be some useful information in there for you guys to kind of think on and hopefully use. So it's a general overview. And we'll look at things like the symptoms, cognitive abilities, and the lived experience and accommodations that can be required by the employees, and this can vary so greatly. Most of us will know somebody who has some form of a neurological condition or a neurodiversity, or will class themselves as being neurodivergent. Most of us will know, and the lived experience is so different. The level of abilities and the cognitive abilities and the processing abilities are so, so different from person to person. And this is why this is such a huge area, because, and it can be a difficult area to manage, because you can't just turn around to employee and go, or sorry, an employer, and say, yes, this person has ADHD, get them this, this, and this. You can't do that without meeting the person. You can't do that without assessing their tasks and assessing their abilities, because, if you have two employees, for example, that have ADHD, they could be totally different in the difficulties that they have and the accommodations that they need. So, before we get into it, what exactly is neurodiversity? Because with all the talk about diversity and inclusion, it is a term you do hear more and more. So, the term itself, it was first introduced back in the late 90s by a sociologist called Judy Singer, and she used this term to refer to a group of what she would call the neurological disorders that impacted the females in her family. So she suggested the name neurodiversity as the term to be used for the political and civil rights movement to recognize the rights and abilities of a neurotype. So what's important to know is neurodiversity, is not a diagnosis. That in itself is not a condition. No humans are the same. No two people process information the same. So technically, the population as a whole is neurodiverse. In the workplace, though, we are referring to, when we talk about neurodiversities, we're referring to employees in the workplace that have neurological conditions as identified within the neurodiversity movement. And it is estimated that about 20% of the global population have what we would term a neurodiverse condition or neurological condition. Um, Reportedly higher in males compared to females. However, my own research, and a lot of it's coming out to back it up, is that actually this difference, this higher level of neurodiversity among males, might be due to actual underreporting from females and maybe misdiagnosis and misrepresentation among females. But that's a discussion for another time. But generally speaking, it's reportedly higher in males than females. And it can be so difficult to manage, and it can be so difficult to find work. So, a 2021 study in the UK by the Office for Statistics showed that an autistic person is the least likely to be in work than any other disabled group, with only 21.7% of autistic people currently in employment. So, the term itself, neurodivergent, it is a non medical term, and it refers to a person with a neurological development that is considered to be atypical or extreme. And examples that are recognized within the neurodiversity movement of these conditions include autism, Asperger's, dyslexia, dyscalculia, hyperlexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, OCD, language delays, Tourette's, dysgraphia, and more. There are more conditions. Um, I'll briefly, for anyone who's not 100% sure or hasn't heard these terms before, just explain what these are. So, autism or autism spectrum disorders are developmental disabilities that are characterized by restrictive, repetitive behaviors, rigid thinking, social communication difficulties, and sensory sensitivities. And Asperger's syndrome will come in under this term, autism spectrum disorder. Dyslexia is a learning difficulty that impacts language development and literacy. Dyscalculia is a learning difficulty that impacts the ability to understand numbers. Hyperlexia is characterized in children by the ability to read letters and words at a much higher level than expected for their age, but there's a lack of understanding there with the words. Dyspraxia is a developmental disorder that impacts movement, motor skills, and coordination. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or also known as ADD, which is attention deficit disorder. This is a neurological condition that is caused by a malfunction of the neurotransmitter chemicals, and this can be characterized by poor focus and attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Again, that's quite a big, and there's a huge range of symptoms there within ADHD, and I will cover that in another podcast episode. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is a condition that causes obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition that's characterized by involuntary movements and noises, which will be called tics. And dysgraphia is a neurological condition characterized by difficulty with writing and copying information. So these will be some of the more recognizable terms that are covered underneath the neurodiversity movement umbrella. Like all disabilities, like all of these kind of things, there's two ways of looking at them. There's two models that are used when describing neurodiversity and disabilities in general. So, and again, I'll just give a brief overview of this. I won't get too into it, but you have your medical model and your social model. The medical model basically assumes that these differences, so whether they're physical or whether they're neurological, these differences, they're disabilities, they are non adaptive deficits, and they are to be treated. Whereas the social way and the social model of looking at these assumes that differences are normal variations in human neurological development and that the issues are actually related to the society, and society should adapt to facilitate and accommodate these differences. And they differ in the viewpoint, but they actually, at present, in the way the world is now, they actually have their function. So to put it really simply, the medical model is what's used to gain entry into the assessment process and the diagnosis process. And often then this diagnosis that you get through the medical model of looking at it is needed to initiate or justify accommodations that are needed in the workplace as are promoted by the social way of looking at it. So the, the social aspect to get the adaptations at the moment, you need the medical part because you need to get the diagnosis. That's just the way the world is now. So the medical model is pretty black and white. Your symptoms, assess, diagnose, treat. Social model focuses more on the lived experience of the person and focuses on the diversity and the strength that those differences can bring to the world and to the workplace. So that's just a very, very brief overview of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement as it pertains to the workplace. So, what challenges do neurodivergent employees face in the workplace? So, and whether you're home working, hybrid working, full time on site working, neurodivergent employees face a range of challenges, and these challenges can increase stress and anxiety, have a negative impact on productivity, and increase the risk, then, therefore, of developing physical discomfort. And some of these challenges are so extreme that they impact the person's ability to stay in a role. So it is really important that we address these. So I'm going to go through these. These are the challenges that are faced and have a think and see, like, does this apply to your organization and or yourself or someone you know? Because there is quite a wide range. The first challenge is actually just for some people can be the job application itself. So actually accessing the employment in the first place. So generally, most job ads are quite, have in the past anyway, been quite text heavy, along with job descriptions, and the application process itself can be quite text heavy and they can be quite overwhelming and stress inducing for somebody who is neurodivergent. They might be absolutely perfect for the role, but they might actually struggle to understand the requirements that are needed. They might struggle to understand the role, or they might struggle to just manage the application process. That alone can be a problem, accessing employment because of standard traditional job application processes. The next area is the interview. So, like, interviews are stressful anyway, let's be honest. But the interview process can cause a lot of apprehension and stress in someone who is neurodivergent. So, this stress might be associated with unfamiliar locations, unfamiliar settings, people they don't know, uncertainty about the questions and expectations. And this can place a neurodivergent person at a disadvantage to what's termed a neurotypical applicant. Um, and again, you can have people who have difficulty managing public transport to get to the interview, difficulty managing time. So the interview process itself, while it is nerve wracking for everybody, it can be disabling for a person with a neurodiversity. just because of all the different stresses that it brings. Another area where they can struggle, I won't say will, but they can, is anxiety over disclosure. So if you get a job, if you're in a workplace, you might not feel comfortable actually disclosing to your employer or to your manager that you have a neurodiversity or you have a neurological condition. And this can be because of fear of negative stereotyping or stigma, social exclusion, or bullying from your colleagues. So the person has made it through the application process, made it through the interview process, is now in the job, but may not feel comfortable actually disclosing their condition because of the fear of negativity associated with it. A lack of consistency can be a problem. And this one crops up with, I find, hot desking. So hybrid working and hot desking environments, which are more common now, um, usually results in a different workstation location or a different setup every time the employee comes to the office. So time is then spent adjusting and familiarizing themselves with the new workstation and the location and all the little things that come with it and the noise and the light and the people. And this can cause stress if they can't get comfortable with the adjusted equipment or certain areas cause distraction or discomfort, a lack of consistency. So going into the office on your days and not knowing where you're going to sit. Now, I know that some employers and organizations have policies now where you can book your desks. Um, but again, in that, it's first come, first serve. They may not be able to get the same location every time. Also within offices, open plan offices can be a problem. Now, open plan offices can be a source of distraction, overstimulation, and stress to somebody who is neurodivergent. So the noise of printers, footfall, traffic, interactions between colleagues, that can all have a hugely negative impact on concentration and productivity. And also, if you have somebody who has sensory issues, issues with the noise and the light could cause a problem for them and could make it really stressful for them to be in there. You can also have a mismatch between tasks and abilities. So, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses, but for somebody who has a neurodiversity, you really want to make sure that the tasks that they're doing match. So, for example, spreadsheets might be really difficult to manage for somebody who has dyslexia or dyscalculia. A task that needs coordination could be difficult for somebody who has dyspraxia. And kind of repetitive, monotonous tasks might not be suitable for somebody with ADHD. So, mismatch of tasks. Again, the person could be great at some aspects of the role, and there could be other tasks that they struggle with. So, that can be a problem. Um, Difficulty managing communication. So, some neurodiversity employees struggle with social interactions. Some actually might be nonverbal themselves. Some might not be able to translate nonverbal cues or jargon or sarcasm or colloquial language in the workplace. Some people struggle with written communications. So, especially something that's quite text heavy, somebody who has a neurodiversity might struggle to actually pull out the important parts of that. And other neurodivergent employees might have issues with short term memory and can struggle to remember information and assigned tasks, especially if it's delegated ad hoc, like during meetings and video calls. Somebody might say, "Oh, Joe, can you do that?" And it's just passed off as a quick comment and you move on. If somebody has a neurodiversity, they could struggle just to remember that. And long meetings without breaks can be, really, really trying and can result in poor concentration and focus and then missing out on the important bits because they were towards the end of the meeting. And the last one I'll cover is just difficulty with standard office equipment. Some employees that are neurodivergent can have issues with motor coordination. So they might be kind of slightly clumsy. They might have difficulty operating like printers or I won't say fax machines. I'm not really sure we use fax machines anymore, but other office equipment. And even just using a standard keyboard and mouse can be an issue depending on their issues with their motor coordination. So these are just some of the issues that an employee who is neurodivergent can face in the workplace. An example of common ones. So what can we do? How can we make a workplace more inclusive to the neurodivergent population? So workplaces that are inclusive and accessible Well, you're going to benefit from a huge diversity of thought, creative thinking, abstract thinking, problem solving, and innovation by just making some accommodations to firstly allow a neurodivergent employee access the workplace and then get the best from them when they're in there. So, the aim of any inclusivity or neurodiversity policy should be to remove the barriers to employment, minimize distractions or discomfort, enhance comfort, focus, and performance, and then facilitate a transition into work and throughout the work and the career. Um, the first thing I will say when it comes to encouraging and helping a neurodivergent employee in the workplace, well, the first thing you have to look at is the workplace culture. So it should be, you should always try and foster an inclusive workplace. And this is not just for neurodiversity, this is also for, disabilities, gender, sexual orientation or orientation, and all different things. An inclusive workplace encourages everyone to be themselves and allows everyone to be themselves and work to the best that they can. So the first thing we try and do is encourage an inclusive workplace. So educate employees about neurodiversity via awareness training, open dialogues, and that will help to create an environment where employees feel safe actually disclosing what condition they have or the traits that they have. And this is the starting point. This is just the starting point. Having employees feel safe to be who they are and diagnose what issues or disclose what issues they're having can help. At the same time, though, there is a balance. It's important that employees don't feel labeled or othered in the workplace, i.e., that's the dyslexic person. That's the person who works in accounts that has autism. That's they don't, you don't want to label them. It's just there's a balance there to just let everyone be themselves, work within the best of their abilities, absolutely discourage bullying and negative talk or slagging or anything like that. Absolutely. Well, workplaces should have a zero tolerance policy for bullying anyway. But creating an environment where people know about neurodiversity, they know what it is, and it might explain why certain people act a certain way and it all makes sense and everyone can just be themselves. Ensure your organization has a neurodiversity policy or has it built into your inclusion policy. And it should include actions for inclusion, such as making sure that if you use, for example, an EAP, an employee assistance provider, that they have training in neurodiversity. Or, for example, some organizations find that workplace mentors can work really well. So, other people within the workplace who identify as neurodivergent can become mentors for newer employees. And having hiring processes that are accessible to everybody can be a good start. So, if we look at an accessible hiring policy, firstly, ensure job ads are more inclusive. And to do that, you should not just advertise on your traditional text based platforms. Have a look at image based platforms too. For example, Instagram, where it's not so text heavy. The job ad is an image that can be easily managed and understood by everybody. In the job description, split the role into really clearly identifiable, absolutely necessary skills and then desirable skills. So, what do you absolutely have to be able to do to get this job? And then what would be nice? Keep the format clear and keep it concise. Only necessary information and no need to fluff it out with other things. Just keep it so concise and clear to understand. Be open to alternative application processes, such as maybe a video application or an image based application. If you're using an online application form, make sure that it can be checked for spelling and grammar before it's submitted. If you use psychometric testing, I would recommend reviewing that this is actually necessary for the application process. And consider, depending on the role, consider anonymous candidate selection. So remove name, gender, and age, etc., from applications when they're being considered, because this can reduce bias. So you're just making it more accessible and more inclusive. The interview process itself, I definitely wish I had some of these for some of my job interviews in the past. To reduce the stress and anxiety, the accommodations that we could make are offer alternatives to standard interview. So maybe they could do a presentation Maybe they could do a trial or a placement to see if they're a good fit instead of an actual standard sitting across the desk interview. And just check, would any of the applicants benefit from maybe seeing the questions in advance, having extra time to read or prepare, give clear directions to the interview location, or maybe advanced viewing of the interview location, or offer alternative locations, or an alternative interview time, maybe outside of peak commuting time for somebody that would struggle with time management and travel, or maybe a quick phone call in advance just to prep them a little bit. Or maybe they could bring someone with them to the interview for support. And during the interview, or during, if that's the process you go, clear, direct questions. Cut the faff, get to the point, make them clear and direct. During onboarding, all new starters should have a very clear and structured discussion about the expectations of the role and what requirements they have to meet these expectations. So if they have any requirements, they should be open to say so. Ensure that all new starters are aware of any supports that you have available to them, including maybe workplace adjustments or assistive technology or software. Any workplace or accommodations or assistive technology should be discussed with the employee first, though, and not assume that they'll want them or need them. So I suppose the best person who determines what they need is actually themselves. So make sure you include them and ensure that all new staff are given a tour of the workplace, including the locations of any key areas, and that they're introduced to all their team members and their HRs and mentors if you have them, and they know who their point of contact is for any work related issues. When it comes to retaining employees, things you can do include um, ensure that they have like personalized development plans, and that they're reviewed really regularly to make sure everything is going as it should and to be able to judge if any assistance is needed. Create a career progression path that is accessible and understandable. And it doesn't have to be linear. It doesn't have to be this role, this role, this role, this role. Maybe it could be this role. And then we move over here to this department and we get a bit of experience here. And then we move to this department. Keep things flexible and make sure that everybody has a career progression path that suits them. Encourage neurodivergent employees to lead by example and act as role models and mentors for others. Review the training that you provide to make sure that it's accessible and supports everybody. Value the differences in everybody. And importantly, if somebody's leaving, and this doesn't just have to be the neurodivergent person, this could be anyone, conduct an exit interview and learn from it. Why are people leaving? And I know it can be difficult for some neurodivergent employees to remain in employment, usually because they experience excessive stress and anxiety because they're struggling with disclosure. They might have a lack of understanding or difficulties with the tasks. Maybe they don't feel integrated and supported by their team, or there could be some bullying or lack of accommodations and lack of progression. But these are all things you'll learn from in the exit interviews. So I would take that as an opportunity to learn, not just from neurodivergent employees, but from everybody. Um, Anyone that's based in Ireland, IBEC and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, ICTU, they launched recently what's called the Reasonable Accommodation Passport Scheme. And this is essentially a confidential live record of barriers faced by employees, accommodations agreed with the employer to overcome these barriers. This is a really, really great tool. And I think it's something definitely organizations should consider to bring on board. Essentially, it is a confidential workplace accommodation process that can be tracked and managed. Any workplace accommodation process should be participatory in that, again, you don't assume what they need. You bring them in and involve them. You assess the issue, you identify the need, you implement the accommodations, you review it, and then you provide any follow up and modifications that's needed. I'll just give you some very short examples of what you could do to help support a neurodivergent employee. So there are assistive technologies available, and the range of these are growing and growing and growing. So you've speech to text software, you've then text to speech software, transcription software, handheld reading devices, noise cancelling headphones are great, screen readers, alternative keyboards and mice devices, spell checking and word predicting programs, assistive listening systems, and visual organizers or like mind mapping software. That's just an example of some of the assistive technologies that you can get to help somebody. Short form communication, written follow up. So if you verbally ask somebody to do something, follow it up with a quick written instruction. Um, Project deadlines can be a struggle for some people. So staggered deadlines or flexible deadlines. And what I mean by staggered is that, for example, instead of giving someone a project and saying, we want this done by the 20th of December, and you give it to them in September, have staggered. So maybe shorter deadlines, have this done by this time. This part should be done by this time. It just helps to maintain focus. Um, some people may benefit from full time homeworking. Some people will benefit from having an assigned workstation. Some will benefit from a flexible work schedule. And these are just really, really crude short examples. There are so many accommodations that can be made, but the crucially, crucially important thing is that firstly, I suppose, make your workplace accessible. When somebody in your workplace discloses that they have a neurodiversity or a neurological condition, that you include them in the process of providing accommodations. So the saying is nothing about us without us. Don't assume you know what they need. And I will find that myself. I have been brought in to do assessments on people who have disclosed a neurodiversity, and they haven't asked the person what they need. So, and a huge part of my assessment will be, of course, you do the office assessment or the workplace assessment. You discuss what's out there, but you ask them what they need or what have they used in the past that worked and what didn't work. Because it can be so overwhelming to go into a workplace and be like, disclose, oh, I have dyslexia, and then to be handed a whole pile of accommodations, and it's overwhelming. Some of them don't work, but you feel like you have to use them because you've been given them. And that can just create such complications and stress. So always include the person in the process. And you know what? Depending on the neurodiversity, they may not need any accommodations. They actually may just need a little bit of understanding. Or for some, it could be as simple as moving a workstation away from an area with high footfall to an area with low footfall. It's not always going to be something drastic. Of course, sometimes it will be, but sometimes little accommodations can make such a huge difference in making sure that the neurodivergent employee feels valued, they feel supported, they can do their job, and they can excel in the workplace. As I said, we are all wired differently. The standard cut out work environment just does not work for, an estimated at least 20% of employees. And you can be missing out on great talent by not being inclusive. That's what I'm going to say on that. That is neurodiversity, my general kind of guide for now. I will follow it up in the future with more specific, targeted advice about different conditions. This is just the overview I've wanted to do for absolutely ages. And I am actually next week, I'm going to be starting a postdoc in neurodiversity. So I am hoping to learn so much more about this and then be able to bring that into my business to be able to provide good sound advice to employees and to workplaces on helping foster inclusive environments. That's it for now. As always, I will put all the details in the show notes. I will put the link to the blog post for this in the show notes, which has some nice images on it. If anyone wants to go and have a look, they might be useful for you. I'll put all my social media details in the show notes as well. And until next time, my next podcast episode is going to focus on, we're taking it out of the workplace a little and focusing on ergonomics and breastfeeding. So, what we can do to reduce discomfort associated with breastfeeding out of the workplace, but still some really, really valuable content in there. Until then, everyone have a great week and stay well.